I could.
I could be wrong.
I could.
I could.
I could be wrong.
I could be wrong.
I could be.
I could.
I could be wrong.
Could be.
I could be.
I could be.
I could be wrong. Well, hey, welcome back to the I Could Be Wrong podcast. We are currently in season 2 of this podcast, and we are covering topics that we've actually been talking about on Sunday morning. It's been kind of the series Stand has been the kind of the guiding factor in this podcast up to this point. And so we're going to continue in that theme. Today, we're going to be talking about sex. And I do want to let you know, if you're a teenager and you're listening, today's topic is going to be PG-13, and we will be discussing sex in different degrees. We'll never be crass, we'll never be rude, but we would ask that you ask your parents before listening to this. Have a conversation with them and let them know why you want to listen, and then ask their permission before you listen to this podcast. So today I'm joined by Pastor Matthew Johnson. Matthew, how you doing today?
I am doing well. It's always good to be here, and I appreciate all the work you put into this, Chris.
Oh, not a problem. It's my pleasure. I'm glad we get to talk about these topics, which I would say this is a topic that we typically don't see talked about on a high degree in the church. We hear a lot maybe of the portions about premarital sex, but we don't hear a lot about like what does healthy sexuality look like, and that's really going to be a lot of the questions that we have today. So you taught a great message on Sunday about the importance in defining what is biblical sexuality and what is healthy sexuality. But today we're going to talk a little bit more about the details. And so we're actually going to break this up a couple different ways, just so if you're listening, so you know, we're going to just hit 4 or 5 different categories and just hit all the questions within those categories as we go. Today we don't have Michael with us.
Right.
He gets a much deserved break, but excited to get into it with just having a conversation with me and you. So
yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome. All right, well, let's get going. So again, we are talking about sex, and one of the things that I think people have a question of, and in regards to the morality of sexuality, is pornography. Pornography, honestly, it's a broken version of sex. But why is it wrong? And is it wrong in all instances? Like, is it okay for married couples to enjoy it since they're enjoying it in the bounds of marriage or whatnot?
Yeah, so let's break the answer down into 2 parts. Let's just look at pornography first and what the Bible says about it. And so the Bible obviously doesn't address pornography in the sense that wasn't a thing in the culture at the time the scriptures were written, but the truths behind it were. And so what scripture tells us, actually, the passage I'm about to quote is one you're going to be teaching on here in a couple of weeks as we continue in our study of the Sermon on the Mount. But when Jesus was talking to that audience and he was talking about lust, he really was giving them a new way of thinking about lust, because they had at that point thought in the context of marriage, the line that they couldn't cross would be adultery. And he says, well, you're understanding in basically the letter of the law, you can't cross over into adultery, but you're missing the heart of it. Because here's really the standard. And he says this to him. So this is Matthew chapter 5, verse 27. He says, you have heard it, that it was said, you shall not commit adultery. But I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman with lustful intent has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Then he goes on and talks about if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off in that passage. And again, I'm not going to go too deep into it because I know you'll be teaching on it. But when you look at that, what Jesus was saying was something I think, again, as with all his teaching, was revolutionary. He was letting them know that looking at a woman lustfully, you could think in your mind, what I'm doing is not that big of a deal because it's just in my mind. It's imagination.
It's not hurting anybody.
Yeah, it's not hurting anyone. There's no victims in this, though obviously it can be argued the person that's in pornography, they're obviously hurt by that. But what he was saying is, no, there's something deeper going on. There is a spiritual reality. There's an emotional reality. There's a mental reality that when you look at a woman lustfully, there's something else going on. And he's like, so in the eyes of God, because this is what's going on, you're connecting to that person. So when we talk about pornography, most often pornography is also associated with masturbation. And so what you're talking about is one of the most intense human pleasures, if not the most intense human pleasure, being connected to this behavior that can be destructive. And so you really are training your mind and body and spirit to enjoy something that is a made-believe world. So in pornography, it's not based on reality. So even when you study the trends in pornography, and I have read a lot about this, I really have. I've studied this quite a bit. that the trends that are really obvious is that in pornography, it is male dominance. It is taking advantage of women. There's a lot of violence now. I read an article in preparation for my sermon last week that said, I want to say it was like 80 or 90% of all pornography has some form of violence inflicted on the woman. So there's a lot of unhealthy behaviors with pornography. But again, it's that when you are engaging that and training your body to engage that fake reality, when you're engaging in something that is sinful, you're training your body to do something destructive to you. Now, why is that destructive? So first and foremost, you're connecting to this person that you're imagining about, and that's going to hurt future intimacy. But also, you're shaping your understanding of what sex should be by something that's not real. And so our culture, I would say almost every single person, whether they recognize it or not, has been shaped, their view of sex has been shaped by a pornographic culture. So like, I'm gonna go a little bit more into this later when we're talking about some of the other questions, I'm sure. But I think even like when you watch something, you might not call it pornography, but when you watch how romance and sex is taught or modeled on a TV show or movies, I mean, like oftentimes what we would celebrate as the most passionate of moments or romance, you know, these two people, they just are so into each other. They're ripping each other's clothes off. They're going into like a house. They can barely make it into the room. You know, that's TV. That's fiction. And so that sets a standard. This is what romance should look like. This is what sex should look like. And it really has reduced it down to just an appetite that needs to be filled. So pornography is not based on reality, and there are victims in it. You're a victim. The person you're looking at is a victim. So there's a lot of layers to why pornography is wrong. First and foremost is the scripture I just read. Lusting is wrong. So then let me go to the second part of the question that you asked is it okay for a married couple to watch pornography? I'm assuming that question is in the context of foreplay and or to make the sexual experience more heightened. I would say, yes, it's 100% a sin because, again, you're lusting after someone that's not your spouse. But I would also say it's damaging because you're missing the purpose of sex that God gave. And I'll explain that in just a moment. But you are now embracing the world's version of sex and trying to mimic it. And that's what's becoming sexy to you or stimulating to you. And yet what God wants is the intimacy to be between two people. So when I talked about on Sunday, the relationship that God gave sex to, as he designed it, was a relationship where the man was focused on loving his wife to the extreme, to the level of dying to himself. So after sin, Paul addresses it in Ephesians 5, but I think it would have been that rhythm in creation. Adam was called to love Eve that way. Eve was designed to be his helper, and so in Ephesians it talks about the concept of submission, but they would be so focused on loving each other, meeting each other's needs, putting each other's needs ahead of their own, that in that context, that's what sex was supposed to be about. So two individuals whose focus is not necessarily just being self-gratified, though there is a self-gratification in sex, but it's the mutual gratification. I'm going to meet your needs, you're going to meet my needs, and in that, we're really going to learn to love each other well. Pornography is not that. It's an illusion. And so you are stripping away God-designed intimacy, and because it's exciting, it's misplacing the purpose of sex, and so it's turning into something else. So it's sinful, but it's also destructive.
Yeah, and it turns what is to be the most intimate thing that we have into a selfish desire. And so so say someone is dealing with a porn addiction, and we use that. I think that term becomes pretty regular with someone who is experienced pornography. Pornography, from our understanding, doesn't come from it's not like typically a one-time thing. It's typically a thing that becomes a habit because it is such a rush in a lot of different ways. It's a dopamine hit. It is all of these things. So it becomes this addictive behavior that we have in our lives. If that is something that someone is experiencing that they're fighting against, what is the help that they can get, or what are the ways in which they can find health and healing from that?
I think first and foremost, they have to acknowledge the addictive power of it. I often say a phrase, if you could have, you would have, but you didn't because you couldn't. What I mean by that is, like, if you could have quit doing it on your own, you would have. I think the individual needs to take steps to put protections around them. I think oftentimes pornography nowadays is attached either to a smartphone device or to a computer. And so if that's a struggle, then you might have to get rid of a smartphone, which obviously would be a sacrifice in our culture. You might, face the people asking you questions and or teasing you. You might feel a little bit out of the loop. But even in the passage of scripture that you're going to be teaching, where he talks about if your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. If your foot causes you to sin, cut it off. If your eye causes you to sin, gouge it out. He wasn't talking about self-mutilation. He was talking about there's a sacrificial element that sometimes has to happen in order to conquer sin in your life. And so I think first and foremost, you might have to get rid of a computer. You might have to not have internet at your house. So like if you're I would say like a young adult and you have internet at your house, and so you constantly are watching things on your TV and on your phones, get rid of internet. And you'd be like, oh man, we can't survive without internet. Yeah, you can, right? I mean,
we did for a long time.
We did, right. And so there's that side of it that you have to just own up to the fact there has to be dramatic changes in order to find victory. But then after that, I would say there's many levels that you're going to need help. You're going to need accountability. There are different programs for that. You need to get counseling. So I would say bare minimum, come have a conversation with the pastor and or director. So if you're a man, you're going to talk to one of our pastors. If you're a female, you're going to talk with one of our directors that are female and talk with you. And then we're going to refer you to counseling to help with this addiction, because I think there are underlying issues that even play into the addiction and different things. And then I think you need support. You need relational support. You need accountability. So there's many layers to it, but I think the first part is acknowledging that it is an addiction, and then starting that process through, I think, inviting spiritual help into that. And I will just say this. I know that sounds like probably the last thing in the world you would ever want to do is go and admit it to someone.
Sure.
I promise you, none of us as the staff that would talk, one, we would hold it in the strictest of confidence, so it would not get spread amongst the staff or anyone else. But we wouldn't think you're weird. That's not our rhythm. We understand the struggles that people have. We've even had people on staff that have had struggles with it and found victory. So it's not a unique sin to just you. It's something that many people, men and women, struggle with. And so we would love you and help you in that process.
Yeah, and I would say, I'll even go into it personally. This was a struggle for me growing up. This is something that that I, through God's help, have found victory in for a really long time. And so, what I guess the hope that I hope someone hears this, that they find it seems impossible to overcome because it's so tied to our emotional responses. Yeah. It's so tied to the different triggers that tell us that we need that. And but at the same time, with God's help, you can overcome it. And it's through the things that you just said, like accountability, the elimination of the opportunity, and those things. So it's something that can be beaten, and with God's help and with the grace of God in your life. So, okay, so let's move on. We're kind of moving through here. So we talked about pornography. Let's talk a little bit about sex before marriage. Some of the questions that people are asking are deal around from the start of living together to like, is there ever a reason to live together, or is that always taboo? Up to the point of like, what is the line that is okay to go to in a dating relationship? So let's start the first question. Okay. Is there ever a reason that it's okay to move in together prior to, and is there ever, like, is finances, protecting your finances, is that ever a good reason not to get married in a relationship? And if so, does that, if you're not married in a setting where you're married like by the government, but you've had a ceremony or whatnot, does that make it okay to have sex? Okay. I asked a couple different questions there, so let me break it down.
So yeah, I mean, I hear the three different questions in my mind. So the first one is there ever a situation where it's okay to live together? So let's be clear, when we're saying live together, we're talking about if you're living together, you're having sex. Right? I mean, is that fair, the question?
Yeah, I'd say that's fair, the question.
Okay, so let's make the assumption that they're not planning on having sex, but they're going to move in together. If you are in a romantic relationship and you think we're going to move in together and not have sex, I would say you're living in a dream world. I mean, especially, I'll end at that. I mean, I think like you're not being realistic and you're putting yourself in a position to fail. And so I would say no. there's no situation that you want to put yourself in where you'd have that type of temptation. The second question that you asked is there, for financial reasons, not to get married? And then you kind of tagged it on with also I think some people will get married in the eyes of God, but not legally in the government. I've heard that question quite a few times. It's typically older people that I've seen that, and even pastor friends of mine that have had to face that question. It's typically older people, and it's for different reasons. For some, their spouse died and they're still getting a pension as a widower. And so if that's the case, I think if they remarry, then they might lose that, so they might lose some finances. Others, it's the fear that if they get married and one has resources and another one gets sick, then those resources now can be taken by the government to pay for that until they're all used up, and then I think Medicare kicks in. And so there's been some questions like that. Here's my heart, and I want to say first and foremost, I'm sympathetic to that reality and that tension. I know, especially when you're retired and the opportunity to make more money is at that point seems gone, that can be very overwhelming. My personal conviction is God has given us the government, and we should follow the laws if the laws don't violate God's commands. And so to get married in the eyes of God so that you can do an end around the laws of the government, to me that feels unethical. I would say that that's not going to be blessed by God. A posture of faith says, I'm going to trust God for my resources. And so in that, if you feel like, I love this person, I need to get married to this person, then I think you should do it legally and in the eyes of God. Now, I want to be clear, you don't have to get married. So like if another person were to come and say, you know what, this has nothing to do with finances, I just, for whatever reason, don't want to get married legally, but I have the same convictions that getting married in the eyes of God is an everlasting thing in the sense of the whole time I'm alive. You don't have to do it legally. Getting married in the eyes of God is how humanity was married forever, right? I mean, so there are some uniqueness into our culture nowadays that if you're not married in the eyes of the government, you can't get the same benefits. So in that sense, I would say it's okay. But I think there's a character thing there. Did I get all those questions?
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, we talked about like someone being sexually active and living together. That's not a thing that God would bless.
Right.
So financially, though, like, is it a good reason? And you said no because the temptation is too much to live together and to be celibate.
Right.
So say someone is living together and they've just learned that this is a thing, being sexually active before you're married, that's not something that God desires. What would you say are the steps if someone's in that situation, they already live together, they're already being sexually active, how do they process out of that?
Sure. Okay, so there's another question in there that you asked that I'm just now realizing I didn't fully understand. I think I answered one part of it. Some people nowadays would say, like, the reason we want to move in together is because it's financially better because we'll have just, one mortgage between the two of us. And so we'll follow that logic for a second, but then also the couple that has already moved in together, living together, sexually active, and then they find out about these standards. Here's what I'd say both sides of it is following God does come at a sacrifice. Mm-hmm. There are choices that we have to make if we're going to follow God, that it's not the easy path. So when Jesus says there's a path that leads to destruction, majority of people go down it and it's easy. And then there's this path that leads to life. Few find it. I mean, he's talking about it being difficult, but it leads to life. When we look at that, the pathway to follow Jesus is a difficult pathway. That's why all the language, and we talk about this all the time, all the language that Jesus used was the imagery of dying to yourself, and there's a sacrifice. It's all for the eternal reward. So the payoff is phenomenal. The payoff is worth it. But the choices we make now require sacrifice. So it might not be the best financial decision to live separate, especially when you're dating and or engaged, mm-hmm. but it's the best thing to do because it's what God honors. And so in faith, you're doing this. I think God blesses it. When we talk about a couple that is living together and then they find this out, we've walked through this many times as a church and as pastors. I remember years ago, and I'm going to use their language, the person who talked to me, But I spoke on this topic of sexual morality. I mean, this is probably 9-10 years ago. And at the end of the service, this boyfriend, girlfriend walked up to me, and the guy goes, "Oh, crap, I did it wrong." And I go, "What's that?" He goes, "We literally just moved in together." He said, "I've never even heard this message. We just moved in together. We love each other. Like, we plan on someday getting married, but we just moved in. What should we do?" And it was like the real honest heart. Like, he's like, "I just want to honor God." I said, "Are you going to get married?" And yeah, you've been dating a long time? Yeah. I said, "Let's get married this week." And they were like, "What?" I was like, "Go get a marriage license. We'll marry you this week in the eyes of God. And then later on, if you want to do a ceremony so all your friends and family can be there, but let's get you married in the eyes of God. You're living together." But that was a couple that they were moving that way. They had health in their relationship in the sense that compatible, treated each other with love and respect. And so they were moving that direction. So that's what I would say to a couple, though, that came, if they were to come to me and say, and we married that couple like on a Tuesday. That's what became our phraseology behind the scene. We would say Tuesday wedding. And it was the idea that there are sometimes we just got to do these weddings in the middle of the week, and that's okay. But I would say to any couple is you have to have a difficult conversation. Are you going to get married? I mean, like, are both of you on the same page? Yes, we're going to get married. And I would say, then get married. Get married sooner than later because, I mean, like, go get a marriage license. Let's marry you. You can do your ceremony later. If either one of you has doubts and you're like, "Well, I don't know that I want to spend," I would say then break up. Not break up, move out from the house together. Potentially break up. I mean, if you don't have the same values, but like move out. And that's sacrificing. That might mean moving back in with a parent. That might mean moving in with a friend. It might mean getting an apartment, and then your finances have to change. But I would say if you don't have that conviction and that clarity, then move out. And then and if that other person doesn't have the same values as you, and now you have that conviction, then I would say do break up that relationship because you're not going in the same direction. But I think it should, at the bare minimum, lead to a really honest conversation. And here's another dynamic of it. If you're living together and you have children together, I would say that's different. But if you're having children together and you're living together, you should be married.
Right.
So at that point, if you're not going to move out, I wouldn't even suggest it because you're parents to those children if you have children together. But that's where I would say, if you want to honor God, let's get married ASAP. If you're like, "Well, I still don't know if I want to marry this person," I think you need to move out.
So moving in together, not the best viable option. Definitely not having sex together. What is the line for dating relationships? How physical is too physical, and how should couples navigate that?
Yeah. So I was a youth pastor for 13 years before I was a lead pastor. I gave this talk every single year, and I'm not exaggerating. Every single year I went through this. My parents were my pastors growing up, and they gave this talk, which is the worst when your parents are the ones that are in front of all the group talking about it. But yet it was such good wisdom that it took to me. But here's what I would say: you need to understand what's going on in your body. And you also need to understand a misconception that culture has projected onto relationships. So here's the two things. The misconception is that making out, so I'm going to use that term, making out, and that's where, so there is affection. Like, so I show affection to my kids. It's a hug, it's a kiss. I mean, and I'll my kid, I'll give them kisses and stuff like that. It's not just one kiss. I'll kiss my kids 10 times, but there's nothing sexual about it. That's affection. I'm affectionate with Mary. That's in a non-sexual way too. Like when I see her and we hug each other and give each other kisses. So affection is a sign of love. Making out is not a sign of love in this sense, is that our culture has said, if you really like this person, love this person, want to connect, then the way you show it is by being sexually active, by making out. And I would say, no, affection is that way. That's actually something completely different. That's designed for something different. So you need to understand that misconception that you don't have to make out. You don't have to have sex in order to grow a healthy relationship. Then to understand your body is your body has a natural response when it is preparing to have sex. And so when you are preparing to have sex, there are certain things that happen. So again, for the listeners, I'm super comfortable talking about this, but I'm going to describe some things. So in order for a male and a female to have sex, there needs to be foreplay to prepare their bodies, because there are physical things that happen in that process. And so for a man, he has an erection that comes about from engaging his mind mentally and sexually, physically engaging. A woman's body prepares by her body self-lubricating. And so like their bodies get ready, get excited for that. That's what takes place when you start the process of kissing and making out, is your body naturally says, oh, I'm getting ready for sex. So with that, know this, your body will not be satisfied until orgasm for male and female. So you are stirring hormones and different things going on in your body that says, in order for me to be satisfied in this moment, I need to have the conclusion of it. And so what happens in dating relationships is initially you kiss, and it's like, nowadays it's really bizarre, because nowadays you can jump right to sex. But I'm saying, like, if a typical rhythm is you kiss, oh, that was exciting. Now you make out a little bit, oh, that's exciting. Oh, that was so much fun, right? I remember, like, when Mary and I first kissed, like I remember that. But then as you progress in that, it always has to go further for it to be exciting. And then you get to that point where your body is primed for sex, but if you never have the payoff for that, you actually have frustration. And so in that, it's super dangerous. The other thing I would say is, in that heightened sexual tension of making out, you don't think clearly.
Right.
No one does. I remember years ago I read this article, and it referred to that as the zone. And I've never been able to shake that, because I thought that was such a good perspective. It was like, you can have standards like set in stone. This, I will never do this. And it's like, but then you get into making out, and all of a sudden you're in the zone. You're an idiot in the zone, because your natural desires are taking over. And then immediately after, you could have the clarity. I mean, the moment after, you have clarity. What have I done? I would have never done that. And so to avoid that, when they ask the question, what's too far? I would say, don't put yourself in a position to lose. So what's too far? In the eyes of God, I'm sure at some point in the process of kissing and making out, you're now starting to lust. That's a sin. But I would say this such an unwise position, because you're not designed to do that in dating. You're designed to do that in marriage, to get ready for sex. That's how you're physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually designed to operate. So I would say to a couple, and this is so countercultural, it will sound old-fashioned and ridiculous, don't bring making out into your relationship. And you'd go, okay, until when? Until marriage. Like, and that is so countercultural that it just sounds like, it almost sounds like unrealistic and foolish. But I would say, so if you can do that, don't do it. And then I would say my other encouragement would be, the longer you can wait, the better. Yeah. And then I would say also, and this is, you're not asking me this, I don't know if this is even any of the questions, but I'm a huge fan of short engagements. I'm a fan of, like, I'm a fan of people getting married young. That shocks people. Like Mary and I, if we could go back in time, we would have got married in 20s. At 20 years old, and been poor college kids together, and that would have been so much better. And
that actually leads to the next question: is it okay to have sex when you're engaged?
No, because again, engagement is definitely moving in the right direction toward marriage. It is the next step to the ultimate commitment, but it's still short of the ultimate commitment. So in the eyes of God, it is the moment that you are married. So in our context, if I'm doing the ceremony, at the very end of the ceremony, I say, by the power vested in me, in our context, you would say the same thing, by the power vested in me by the state of Ohio, but more importantly, by God, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride. But the moment I pronounce them husband and wife, God honors that moment. In that moment, they are husband and wife. That's what sex is designed for. So truthfully, as committed as you are engagement, that's still not what God designed sex for, because it is that ultimate religious ceremony that God honors. And I think sometimes we lose sight of that. We're a non-traditional church.
Sure.
And so I know you were raised more in Lutheran, so there's more, I think, a better understanding of the sacredness of the ceremonies. Yeah. So even at times, like we're really purpose now trying to get people to understand the sacredness of communion. Right. But I think baptism is another one. Like, this is not just a physical thing. It's not just a person going down in water and coming back out. The same thing about the ceremony. There's something spiritual going on when you are pronounced husband and wife. God blesses that union. And so again, but that's why I would say I would have a short engagement. I think these people that get married, get engaged, and they say we're gonna get married in 2 years. I say this lovingly. That's, to me, if you're trying to be sexually pure, that is really foolish. I'm talking like year max, for engagement, and the shorter, the better. I know Mary and I, we got engaged in October and got married in July of the year that we got married. And that was the most difficult time in our relationship, bar none. We dated 8 years. So we started dating when I was a freshman. Mary and I were both virgins when we got married. But that was so difficult at that time. And I even thought then, like, there's no way for us to avoid it. It was just how we scheduled it. But I was like, man, and even in that, Mary was gone for some of that because she was still in college. But yeah, that was a difficult time. So,
yeah. And so last question in regards to premarital dealings with sex. So if a couple does have to wait a long time, what are some guidelines? What are some practical things that they can put in place so that they can stay pure in that relationship?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think some things that I've said throughout the years is one of them is I think both of you having a conversation where you both communicate your values. This is what we want to do together. If like, say the girl has that in her mind, like, I want to be sexually pure, but she never communicates that boy might not be thinking the same thing, might not even have the same convictions, might not have the same knowledge.
Right.
So both of you together communicating, this is what we want to do. I would also invite into that, depending on your age, I would invite accountability into it. So whether it's a friend, a parent, just someone else to say, hey, this is what we're doing. Will you check me on this? And I know that's hard. That feels awkward, right? I mean, you're like, oh, come on, that feels goofy. But I'm saying, if you're really wanting to do it, it's just a sacrifice you have to make. But then in your relationship, don't put yourselves in positions where it's easy to compromise your standards. So a simple one, Mary and I, this was a rule given by our parents, but we honored it because we could have, I think in a secret way, broke this rule. But the rule that our parents had was we could not be in the house alone together. So if I went on a date with Mary and her parents went home, we just knew we had to stay out. Now, again, obviously we could have gone and parked somewhere, but we chose to honor not just the letter of that law, but the heart of it. And so we would go to dinner by ourselves. We'd go to movies by ourselves, but those are public settings. We would never go anywhere private. So we never once parked somewhere and, in secretive so we could make out, never violated by going in either of our parents' homes. So I think that's a big one. And I think even nowadays with people marrying later is that by the time a lot of them are dating, some of them have their own apartments and stuff. And so they can spend time at each other's apartments. I wouldn't. I absolutely would not. And I know how hard that is, but if you're dating and you have your own apartment or own house, I would not be in it together because you're asking for trouble in that situation. I would not vacation together. This is a trend that I find super dangerous. For two reasons I don't like this. One is because I think it's super dangerous, and two is I think just the looks of it's awful. But I see Christians all the time now that are dating that go on vacation together. And they might be staying in separate rooms, but you don't know. So one, right. It just looks bad. I'm just being honest. It looks bad. But the second is I think there's something hyper romantic about vacations. And so like if you're going to these beautiful settings, a beach and stuff like that, I'll even be real direct here. And you're in bathing suits all day and you're looking at each other and like you're priming your bodies for that. And so you just have to use a lot of wisdom. Then the things I've said already of not starting the physical. If you don't start the physical, then this won't be a problem.
Right.
The boundaries. If you start the physical, that's what we're talking about, is then you just got to be really careful where you go. But make sure that you're praying together as a couple. And it doesn't have to be intense, long prayer sessions, but just that constant reminder. This is what we're doing together. At the end of the night, we're going to pray together. Every single time, maybe do devotions together. But I'm just saying, like, at the end of the night, because I'll tell you what, there's nothing's going to feel more awkward then you cross a line and then you have to pray together.
Yeah.
And that's not the only reason to pray, but you know what I'm saying, asking God's help. So I think if you bring some help into it, bring some accountability, make sure you don't put yourself in positions to lose, I think you're going to find success.
Yeah. And again, this is so countercultural. And I think a lot of people are going to hear it and go, man, this is impossible. But again, I think your story is it's not. And,
right.
And so it is hard work. It takes a lot of extreme measures, but you can live this out. Our culture says you can't.
Right.
The reality is you can.
So let me speak one more thing to this. So like I said, I have so studied this principle so that there's a lot of things to it. I wish I would have more time. But one of the things people need to understand is dating as we see it in America is a modern phenomenon. And what I mean by that is within the last really like 60 to 70 years. So no culture ever in human history treated the process into marriage like we do as Americans. So even early on in America, if you went back 60, 70, 80 years, the modern day dating concept is unheard of. So in that culture, it would have been the parents were basically, it wasn't arranged marriage in America, but it was close in the sense of like, let's have conversations with our kids, with another family that we know and respect. Let these two date, but they're going to date in the house of the parents. So they're never going off by themselves. They're going to have accountability. They're going to interact to see if they like each other. If they don't like each other, they're not being forced into marriage, but then we try to find someone else. And so there was real hands-on. Within the last 60, 70 years, it's changed to where now the person that's dating, so high schoolers now into young adults, are empowered to make the decision for themselves, and dating has changed into there is isolation, and it looks completely different. So it is extreme what we're saying, but it's extreme because the last few decades have so radically changed what dating looks like that now we're like, oh, that's ridiculous, that's impossible, and it's not. And so again, all these relationships for human history that did not bring physicality into it until marriage, didn't bring kissing and making out and sex until marriage, these relationships had way more success rate than what we have today. So like the thought now, and I'm not wanting to go back and arrange marriage and stuff like that, but I'm saying the thought that somehow our dating process and our self-empowerment has made for better marriages is not true.
Right.
When you have a mindset of commitment to purity and then just commitment to marriage, marriages will be healthier and better. And so our culture has changed that. So again, I know it's extreme, but it's only extreme because of how crazy our culture is.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about sex in marriage now. Mm-hmm. And so the thing that I think, or at least this question that was posed to us kind of brings about is this mind switch from premarital relationship where sex is kind of off limits, and I think in a lot of ways it gets conditioned as a bad thing, and not that it is a bad thing, that sex is ever a bad thing, but in the context of pre-marriage, of not being married, sex can be a damaging thing. Mm-hmm. But then once you step into marriage, now it's the healthy thing. Right. Now it's the good thing. How can you make that mind shift? How should we make that mind shift? And how do we walk through that process of making sex a healthy part of our marriage?
Yes, those are great questions. I think one of the reasons why we have such a difficult time in the transition from how people viewed sex before marriage, and these are people that I'm saying that are associated with the church, that they've heard the biblical narrative of this and the biblical ethics of sex. Why it's so difficult is, on one hand, and I said this on Sunday, our culture has a very bizarre relationship to sex and talking about sex. So in our culture can be crass, can be crude, can be hypersexual in the sense of what it shows on TVs and movies and just, magazines, and then obviously pornography, and people can make jokes about it, and that's not awkward. But then you want to have a serious conversation about sex, and that's what's awkward. Mm-hmm. So you could be in a group, and people could say like, oh, hey, you guys heard the joke, and they could tell a crass joke, and the room goes, ah, ha, ha. But in that same room, if you were like, hey guys, can we talk about like healthy sex practices? Everyone would be so awkward, right? They'd be like, what, dude, you're crazy, stop. And that's what's weird about our culture. To some degree, that's what's happened in the church world. Is in the church world, the only time we talk about sex is to say this is what's not allowed. And so when we talk about what is allowed, then that seems awkward. That seems weird. And some people would even say there's no place for that in church. Because I know I have taught, and I've been pretty open when I talk about sex. Like I've been purposed to do this. And I remember at times talking about sex and having people get mad. I've even had people leave the church, literally. And people left the church because they thought, well, this is not a place to talk about sex. And what I was talking about, nothing was crass, nothing was crude, but I was encouraging couples to pursue sexuality in the biblical context, which we'll talk about here in a moment. And I remember even one time I did a challenge to like
14-day challenge.
14-day challenge. I encourage couples to have sex for 14 straight days. And that was such a funny Sunday. We had like a lot of guys on their way out were like, giving me thumbs up, which was funny. But then I heard like people say like, it was just, the whole thing was funny. We had visitors that Sunday that were like, I like this church, like some jokes like that. But then some people were upset about that. And they thought I was being almost flippant about it. And I said, no. I wasn't being flippant about it. I'm a very purpose person. I was trying to express to them, I want you to just make it a priority and see what changes in your marriage. And I even wrote a paper that I gave them later. And I said, when you make it a priority, what you discover is how many things interfere with you and your spouse, your intimacy. And there are so many other things that become a priority, and you need to work at it. And also, if you're going to be purposed to have sex, you have to work through some issues, because you're like, hey, I'm not feeling this right now because I'm still frustrated with you. And so like the couples who did that responded well and said that was an eye opener for us. And so, but what was interesting is some people were upset about that because they had conditioned their minds to think, sex is not supposed to be talked about in church. And so I think there are people that legitimately have incredible guilt that are virgins when they're married because they have been told like, protect this at all costs. And then now enjoy it. Yeah. And that is a weird pivot. I think the way that we can overcome it is to have conversations like this, where we're talking about more so in front of teenagers and young adults and adults, where we're saying, no, sex is this beautiful thing. Like God wants you to have the absolute best sex life. God cares more about your sex life than the world does. The world is trying to experiment with you and exploit you. God actually cares about your sex life. He wants it to be enjoyable. He designed you to be this way. So having these types of conversations, I think, will go a long way to helping people in that.
So what is the biblically healthy sex life look like in a marriage?
Sure. I think there's many layers to it. So the first is the foundation. And I cannot stress this enough, where both people are committed to loving each other well, putting each other's needs above their own. And I'm not just talking about sexual needs. I'm just saying needs in general. A woman who feels loved in that way will be more open sexually to her husband. A husband who feels respected by his wife. So even in Ephesians, where it says at the very end, like, I know this is a complicated idea, but husbands, make sure you love your wife as Christ loved the church, and wives, respect your husbands. He's reiterating this principle that a wife, the female oftentimes needs to feel secure, and feels secure by having someone take care and put them as a priority in their needs. When a husband feels respected, and that's what happens in submission, of just saying, like, I respect you, I'm here to honor you. In that context, both people feel safe at the level that true sexual intimacy can take place. Once they're married and they're now engaging sex, so this was the ideal from the beginning, was they would not have any sexual experience prior to marriage, and together they would learn about sex. So together they would explore each other's bodies and each other's pleasures and what they like and don't like. Like the scripture says, and they were naked and unashamed. That's what's supposed to play out in marriage, is together we can have total physical vulnerability and emotional vulnerability, mental vulnerability, and we're so safe in this environment that I'm not the fear of being exposed, and so we can love each other well. I remember I had a good friend of mine. His name was Brad. He's probably about 10 years older than me. He was actually he was in charge of our men's ministry in the church I grew up in, but he also was one of my youth leaders. So when I became youth pastor, he was on our team. So he had been married, like I said, probably about 10 years more than I had. Gave me some incredible advice. Him and his wife, Sherry, had and have a great marriage. And I remember him saying to me a couple things. He said, this was his encouragement. Some people will disagree with this. Don't get twisted about this. But he just said, when you get married, his suggestion was wait 5 years before you had kids. And some people have different convictions about that. He goes, really get to know your wife, enjoy, and stuff like that. Mary and I waited for. But then the other thing he said, and this was an odd advice because I did not understand it. He said, sex will get so much better when you learn to talk during sex. And I was like, that means nothing to me.
Okay.
Yeah, that means nothing to me, okay? And what I understood later was what he was saying was not like, while you're having sex, you're like, how was your day? Your day was good. He was saying being able to talk about what you like, what you don't like, being able to have that freedom in sex. This is what God intended, is that there would be an exploration where there would be of each other's bodies and what each other likes. And this would be this beautiful thing, that there weren't limits set around it. What the context of limits, because people often say, like, what can you and can you not do in sex? Yeah. And I would say it's all based on what each other feels comfortable about. So if you're both comfortable to explore, that's an okay thing. That's a beautiful thing. You don't want the other person to feel, you don't want them to have pain. You don't want to do something that's degrading. You don't want to do something that makes them feel threatened. And not even to ask them, because out of respect, they might say like, well, I'll do it because you want me to do it. But that's not the heart of sex. It's not about exploitation. It's about loving and together figuring that out. What's the problem is, and I said this earlier, our image of sex has been shaped by a pornographic culture. So when we see sex on TV, and like I've already alluded to this, where two people are making out in the hallway, and then they go into the doorway and they're ripping each other's clothes off, and clothes are strewn all the way to the bedroom and stuff. Okay, maybe that can happen, but that's not typical sex. That's not the normal sex. Normal sex is completely different than that. Sometimes marriage sex it's scheduled. It's at this time on this day because we got to work our schedules out for it. Sometimes it's in the morning, sometimes it's in the evening, it's different things. And in 1 Corinthians 7, it's a passage that if you take it out of context, it would be a really politically incorrect passage. But what it talks about is it says, your body no longer belongs to yourself. Your wives, your body is your husband, your body is now your wife. And it's not talking about exploitation. It's talking about taking a posture that says, I want to give my body in any way necessary so that my wife can be fulfilled, and vice versa. And in that beautiful image of sacrifice, of dedication to each other, there is freedom. There's freedom to enjoy sex and to experiment with sex, and it should be that process. And if you have pornography in your past, or you're bringing it into your marriage, you're bringing in a cheapened version of sex, and you have to work to get away from that. So if you had pornography in your past, you have to understand, I'm not trying to recreate what I've seen in the past. I'm trying to discover what works in this context. And in that, to love each other well. So the last thing I would say, and you can ask follow-up questions if you want, is a lot of people ask, like, how much sex should you have? You should have sex. This is all within reason. Again, not in a culture of exploitation, but you should be striving to have sex as much as the person who wants it the most. So if one person has less need for consistent sexuality, so let's say, I'm just making up numbers here. Let's say a person is like, you know what, I would be good to have sex once a week, or every 4 days. And the other person's like, you know what, I would like sex every other day at the minimum. That would help me. And then I think in love, you go, let's meet that need. Let's meet that. And obviously there's going to be times where it doesn't work out, right? If a person's like, you know what, I want sex every single day. And you're like, okay, let's figure out how we can make this a reality. So in love, the person who doesn't need it as much goes, I'm going to work hard to make this a reality. The other person who needs it every day or desires it every day realizes it might not happen every day. So their version of sacrifice is, okay, I'm not going to get mad. I'm not going to upset. I'm not going to get pouty. It's just, that's how the relationship's going to work. I think that's really honoring, and that's what God intended. And so, like, each couple's different. And I know we've made a lot of jokes in the past that, like people have, that the guy is the one who always wants sex, but the reality is that's not true. It's sometimes the wife who wants it more than the husband. Both have to desire to meet their spouse's need. Okay, I said this would be the last thing I said. I said it before. I'm going to say it one more time. One other thing that happens oftentimes is people say, okay, what if one spouse just has no sexual desires? Sometimes that happens because of medications. Sometimes that happens because of age. Sometimes that happens just because people are more asexual, where they just don't have those desires. Sometimes it's because of abuse. I really do think the person who doesn't have the strong sexual desire, if their spouse does, they need to pursue every option to get to that place. They need to see a counselor. They need to get medical help. They need to explore different things in order for their spouse to be sexually satisfied. And it might be total one-sided in that you're not getting a lot of pleasure out of it, but that truly is love, to say, even though this is not for me, I love you enough, I'm going to do this for you. And I think that's the greatest sacrifice, but I think it's what we're called to do.
So you kind of hint at it there, and it's this idea of really even the platonic marriage. You hint on it there. Can that work? You said do everything you can to make it not. Can it work if both parties agree on it? Can it work? Or is there ever a situation where you think that this would be a healthy marriage sans sex?
The only So you're saying platonic if one of them wants it and the other one doesn't, or if they both want it?
I would say it's probably an easy conversation if they both want to be platonic.
Right. Yeah.
But if one wants to be platonic and the other one doesn't.
Yeah, I would say that the danger of it, there's two levels of danger. At the bare minimum, you have one person that feels unfulfilled, and I do think in some case will feel unloved because their partner's not willing to do what's necessary to meet their sexual needs. And sex is more than just a physical need. You know, I think that's oftentimes what gets portrayed of men. You know, if men want sex a lot, and typically, I'm just going by statistics. Statistically, men do desire sex more than women and want it more. Like I said, it's not always the case. But I think it sometimes gets reduced down to just this physical thing. So like a spouse, a woman could be like, good grief, you know, that's all you ever think about and stuff like that. The reality, though, even for men, it's not just a physical thing. Mm-hmm. There's a part of their identity that if their wife doesn't reciprocate in the sexual advancements and engage them, they can feel less of a man. They can feel less masculine. And the same thing for women. Mm-hmm. If a husband is the one who lacks the sex drive, the wife can feel not attractive, not sexy, and therefore have body image and other insecurities. And so I think if one person in that desires it, I think, again, on one level, it's damaging to them to not have that met. The second level would be, because it is a desire they have, I think it's opening the door for adultery. Because all it would take is Satan manipulate. Not all it would take. I'm not saying that every single person is going to fall into adultery, but Satan could manipulate that.
Right.
And so all of a sudden, Satan knows that this one spouse is not sexually fulfilled. Bring someone into their life that's going to give them that attention, going to flirt with them, going to try to get them to engage that way, and they go down that pathway, and it hurts the marriage. So I don't think platonic is the only way. I think that works is if both of them want it. But I think otherwise, and you have some people that they want sex and they might say, you know what, I'm not being damaged by it, but that my partner doesn't. So I'm not going to speak that into and try to create confusion in marriages. Mm-hmm. But I think that's when you have to have a really honest conversation where you both express, no, I'm not okay with this. Yeah, this is what I need.
Right. And I think so key to the heart of healthy sexuality in marriage really even stems outside of the bedroom.
For sure.
And how we foster that intimacy, not just in the bedroom, but outside of the bedroom as well, and serving our spouse. And I don't remember where I heard this, but I heard a quote somewhere say, sex starts in the kitchen. So essentially, like the idea of, like, if a clean house is what my wife needs to feel safe, to feel comfortable and at ease, then it starts by preparing that way. Mm-hmm. We've talked about serving the other spouse in their sexual needs. How does that reciprocate or does that reciprocate into the rest of life?
Yeah, 100%. And it's not, it's the argument of what comes first, chicken or the egg. Right. I think it's that same concept as the relationship. I'm glad you pointed that out. The relationship before sex starts in just the health of relationship. And then after sex, the follow-up is the health of the relationship. So I recognized this years ago, and this isn't always even a sexual thing in my own marriage, but like Mary and I, when we were talking about like what our needs are. So I have a need I need personal connection. Like it is, so everyone on staff knows this. What I need to have my emotional tank filled is quality time with Mary. Nothing fills it like that. I love family time. And I could fill it to a level, but I just need to go on dates with Mary. I need to hang out with her. So I need that on a daily basis. And so I remember years ago, Mary and I made this deal that every single night we're going to come together and watch one TV show together. It was just like a priority. We still honor this. We still do this every night. And but she said to me lovingly one time, she said, in order for me to do what you're asking, I need your help. Basically, if you want me to come do that, then I need you to help me get my side of responsibilities done. And I realized I wasn't. I was failing in that area. And so now I try as best I'm able to just look around and figure out, like, hey, what else is Mary going to have to do? And so in some sense, it sounds self-serving because I'm like, I got to get this done so that she can come upstairs, right, and hang out with me. But I think it's just a way to her heart. And so in that leads to us connecting. And the more we connect, the more I want to help her and the more she wants to help me. So, like, when I do all of that, she wants to hang out with me. But if she's the one doing all the work and I'm sitting upstairs chilling out, she doesn't want to hang out with me. And I think the same concept can be applied to sex. And so, yeah, I think they just it creates that synergy in a marriage that is so healthy. And I think so many guys mess up on this. I'm gonna speak for guys because I am a guy, but I think so many guys mess up because the only time they touch their wives is sexual touches. So it's the smack on the butt, it's the grab of something, they grab their butt or their breast, and it's a very sexual touch, and not realizing their wives need more than that. So like they need affection without groping, and they need to be hugged. They need to have a kiss that isn't trying to lead to sex or to making out. They need compliments that aren't for the purpose of sex. So it's like, you look pretty versus like, ooh, you look hot, and follow some language after that, right? Mm-hmm. Like where I want to do something. And so I think just recognizing, I think even the same thing for women is the words that you speak. If you're constantly degrading your husband, arguing, kind of picking at him, just know that that's going to his heart and soul, and that's going to impact how he relates to you. So in the marriage where you can try to meet each other's needs in the practical of life, you can try to meet the affection needs that are non-sexual, especially for the woman. I think that's going to lead to a healthier sex life. And I would say to women, I alluded to this a little bit earlier, but one of the most damaging things you can ever do is to imply that your husband's sex drive, or I would say this in one of the sex drives is more, to imply your husband's sex drive is some dirty thing. So to say like, that's all you ever think about, you're just dirty because you want to have sex all the time. I would say that's one of God's greatest gifts that he's given, that your husband is drawn to you, that he wants to have sex with you. Don't degrade that, because we don't do this in marriage in any other way. We're not like, oh my goodness, you're hungry again. Like you ate yesterday.
You want to talk to me again?
Right. Yeah, exactly. You want to talk to me again. You have a desire. Like, so if the husband said to your wife, like, I'm sorry, you told me a story yesterday. Like how weird are you that you want to tell me another story? It's like, we don't do that with other needs, but then some reason with sex, we don't treat it like a normal, healthy, God-given physical need. And so we don't want to degrade what is natural and what's even different. So my wife is more of a person that wants to talk, more of a storyteller. You ask me a story, I'm most likely I can get it done in 10 words or less, right? Like I can, and it's weird, I'm a talker in the sense I'm answering questions, but I've learned to do that. But I can give you the summary statement. My wife wants to tell details. And I've had to learn that, like, I used to almost degrade that by saying, like, a better communicator would tell that story quicker, right? I was just being an impatient jerk, honestly. I've had to learn to go, you know what? No, I'm going to not just tolerate this as if I'm doing some noble thing. I'm going to celebrate it. My wife wants to tell me details because she wants me to enjoy the same joy that she had when she experienced a story or heard the story. And so, again, it's just that same concept of, like, just having nonstop respect, attentive to each other's needs, having those conversations, and responding to it.
Sure. You said that you've studied this a great deal. What are some resources that people can look at when it comes to learning how to grow in their sexual health, as a Christian couple particularly?
Yeah. Probably the best book ever written on it. This is probably, good grief, this might be a 30-year-old book. But it's called Intended for Pleasure. I wrote it down, Intended for Pleasure. It's a couple, Ed Wheat and his wife, Gay Wheat, so Ed and Gay Wheat. And he's a medical doctor, I believe, but they wrote a book that really explores sexuality in the context of marriage and a biblical marriage. I think that's a great resource. I think Jimmy Evans is another one who has written a lot on marriage, him and his wife, and they also have a marriage ministry called Marriage Today. And we've actually had, Jimmy Evans has come and spoken at our church multiple times, and we've sponsored that ministry. We've hosted the XO conference is what they have. And his stuff is great. And what I love about his stuff is he's constantly updating it. There's podcasts and different things. There's just so many resources that they provide. And that's what I would encourage people is to look for Christian resources. I'm not saying that non-Christian stuff is all in and of itself bad, but it's not going to have the same foundation.
Right.
And so there's an element even to some of the secular stuff that is about self-protection versus the biblical perspective of submitting and dying to yourself for your spouse. But I think both those books, I think there's another book called Love and Respect, which is a fascinating look that what women need is love and what men need is respect. And I think that one is somewhat timeless. When I've done marriage mentoring and we've walked through that, people have really resonated well with that. So Jimmy Evans' book, Marriage on the Rock, so it's a play on the Marriage on the Rocks. Marriage on the Rock, it's a phenomenal book. Love and Respect is a good one. Intended for Pleasure is one if you want to grow in sexuality. And I would encourage, if you read that book, get you and your spouse to read it together. And even nowadays, if some people aren't readers, a lot of these books you can get on Audible and listen to an audio version of it. And I think that's helpful.
I would add I think it's Gary Chapman's The Five Love Languages.
Yeah,
and that's it doesn't necessarily deal with sex per se, but it's more so the idea of learning your spouse and learning how to love your spouse well, which is key in
what's the basic premise? It's that you have a love tank, right?
Yeah, you have a love tank, and he gives, I think, 5 different love languages. I'm going to butcher these. It's going to be like service, acts of kindness, or acts of
service,
acts of kindness,
gifts,
affection, gifts, and
quality time.
Yeah, I think that's a 5.
The bad one about it is the affection one says it's like what is it? It's not even worded affection. It's like physical touch.
Yeah.
And I know, like, if that's your love language, it makes you seem like, because that's one of my love languages.
Yeah.
You know, and it makes you seem like that almost sounds dirty. Like I just have to grope or something. But it's more than that. And so if you're physical, or if your love tank, if you know your spouse's love language and you speak that by doing those things, it fills her love tank, and vice versa. And that's the point of the book. Yeah, that's a timeless book. And they also have different versions of that. They have like the love language of your teenagers, love language, I think, of employees or something like that to help you better understand. So there's other ones from that are also really good.
Great. All right, we're going to transition now to talking about dealing with sex with our children. And how do we approach the topic of sex with kids? How do we talk to them?
Sure.
When is it appropriate? I realize I sometimes ask multiple questions just to kind of introduce the topic. So let me start with one question. At what age should you begin talking to your kids about sex?
Man, this will probably be shocking to a lot of people. I think it gets earlier and earlier. We have chosen with our kids about the age of 10. So 10 seems to be the age that they have been exposed to enough. So our kids, so I'd say, here's what I would say. The age, if your kid gets exposed to something, then that has to start sooner.
Right.
So if your kid comes home and asks you a question that's like hyper specific, and and again, you have to use wisdom. If a 6-year-old comes home and says, Mommy, Daddy, what's sex? You might go, we're going to talk about that later because I don't want to shatter your world as a 6-year-old. But I think as kids get older and what they're exposed to. But for us, that was the age where we felt like our kids were mature enough to understand it, where it wouldn't be overwhelming to them. And so I would say that's a good age. And I'm assuming the follow-up question would be, so how do you talk to your kids?
Yep.
Yeah, so in our context, I want to be careful because I don't want to tell too much personal information because I don't want to embarrass my children ever. But like ours was gender specific. I talk to the boys, Mary talks to our daughter. And that even going forward, when our kids have questions, the boys come to me, Nora will go to Mary, and we've developed that rhythm. For me, I took each of my sons out, and I actually made a fun day out of it in the sense that we went somewhere, had fun. I didn't want it to seem like weird, weirder than it has to be. There are some elements that are kind of weird, but so we went, we had fun. We did had dinner and did some type of activity that was a lot of fun, and then. I remember got milkshakes and different things, and we were just talking. I said, hey, guys, I want to talk to you about something, and I want to explain to you what it is. And what I did is I tried to make it as normal as possible, not weird. And I realized a lot of people, that's just the thought of that is probably super nerve-wracking to them. I would encourage them to there's so many good websites that can talk about this. Focus on the Family is a great resource where it can even give you somewhat scripts to follow, or just kind of headings to get. I would suggest writing it down if you're not a good natural communicator. I am obviously blessed in that I communicate for a living, but I remember writing down all the different things I wanted to cover, and then I just talked my kids through it. So there was a part of it of explaining sex and the act of sex and what that is, explaining the biblical standards of morality and why that is. And we celebrate sex as a good thing. So we when the kids first hear it, I don't know if you can imagine or if you can remember the first time you heard, you just described something to them that is rocking their world. They're like, what in the world? And so each one of my kids processed different. I'm not going to tell you names because I'm not going to embarrass my kids. But I had, at least one of my kids immediately asked me 25 questions. Good questions. Okay, so what about this? What about that? What about that? Another one of my sons was basically didn't make eye contact with me. And I said, do you have any questions? And I said, no, I'm good. And I respected that. I said, okay. But with all of them, I said, hey, if you ever have a question, feel free to come talk to me. I'll never criticize you. You'll never be in trouble. I'll never embarrass you. And every single time, 100% of the time, my kids have come and asked me a question. I've said, thank you for bringing that question to me. Thank you for trusting me to bring that. And I've answered it as if it's the most normal question in the world. And you know what was sad about it was some of the questions my kids asked me when they were 5th grade, 6th grade, were very sexual questions because they heard kids at school talking about it. And I was so bummed as a parent that that's how they were exposed to those things. But in the same sense, I was thankful that I had built that relationship that was comfortable so that they could come talk to me about it. I think also as a parent, you have to have follow-up questions based on what season your kid's life is in. And that's a perpetual thing that I have to do. And if your kid's dating versus not dating, and then preparing them for dating. And so you just have to have that ongoing conversation. And the more normal you can make it, the better. My parents were wonderful at this. They made it so normal that I never had any insecurity coming and talking to them about it. They're rare though. And Mary and I are rare, I know, for a lot of parents. Most kids, their sex ed is through the locker room, through the hallways at school, just hearing people talk about stuff. And unfortunately, that's very much shaped by a pornographic culture.
Yeah, and if you can keep that conversation going, because it's not just having that conversation one time. It's that ongoing comfortability that your kids can have coming back to you as they experience new things. Because I don't think you can cover everything at one time. You know what I mean?
Right.
Which kind of leads us to our next question is what can we do as parents to really protect our kids and to help them navigate the culture that they live in? Because you mentioned on Sunday, we live in a highly sexualized culture.
Yeah.
So how do we help our kids and give them, beyond just having good conversations, how do we help them navigate those waters?
Yeah, and Chris, I would even say this, in the future, we might want to dedicate an entire podcast just to this question.
Sure.
Because what I would say that, and I say this lovingly and not trying to be condescending or condemning, I would say the average parent needs to do way more than they are to protect their kids. And that's just from experience of talking with people. So I'll tell you what Mary and I do. I don't try to pretend to be perfect, but we're purposed. And so that's what's different than a lot of people. We protect our kids as best we're able. So my kids all do have, my daughter doesn't, she's 10, but my 3 sons have phones. They have iPhones, so they have smartphones. But they don't have access to the internet on them. And if they do, or my oldest son does some capacity, but there's restrictions even on that, and I can see anything he looks at. But the other ones don't just have access to the internet. So they don't have, in the iPhone world, they don't have access to Safari, where they can just open it up and look at stuff and searches. I limit their amount of screen time. So I can set it on the phone as part of Apple's software, and it limits how much time, just in general, they're on their electronic device. But any app they want to download on their phone, I have to approve. So I have the ability to say yes or no to what is on their phone. Our kids don't have social media. And so my oldest son, who's a senior in high school, he has Instagram with my constant monitoring of it. And my other kids don't have any form of social media. And here's what I would say. And again, I'm trying to be a balance here because I'm not trying to embarrass my children. And this is an odd dynamic of having your dad as the lead pastor. But it's been a very emotional conversations at times. It's really tough because every other kid has free access to Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, and all these other programs, and they don't. And so there's an element that they're on the outside. But when I study those programs, all I find over and over, so Facebook and Instagram has been proven. Facebook released a study that it makes teenagers, and specifically girls, feel way worse about themselves. People's exposure to pornography is happening more often with social media than it is with any other form, their initial exposure that then leads to pornography. So as parents, if you aren't monitoring what your kids are seeing, I promise you they have been exposed to pornography. By the age of 18, it's 94% of kids nowadays have been exposed to pornography, and the average age of exposure is now 11 years old. So the parents who give their kids a smartphone without any restrictions, give them internet in their room, I'm just telling you, your kid might not only be looking at pornography, they might already be addicted to pornography. That's how serious and how quickly it can happen. If my kids are watching Netflix or whatever, it's all that stuff's password protected. And so I have limited on age what they can see, so what types of movies they can see. It's password protected, and all of it is an ongoing conversation. As they're getting older and I'm expounding their permissions and their privileges, it's still with monitoring. And so it's never just like, oh, okay, you're an adult. I mean, even, I don't even think 18 years old is the time where all of a sudden you just take restrictions off. So if they're living in my home or going to college and I'm paying for their college, I'm still going to have restrictions on the things because I want to protect their minds and heart. And that's the conversation I have all the time with them. As I say, I realize this is hard for you. I realize it makes you feel like an outcast. I realize you might even be frustrated with me. I'm protecting your heart. I am called to protect your heart more than I'm called to have you like me, more than I'm even called to have you fit in with everybody else. And that's a constant reminder that I need to have. So Mary and I have constant conversations about it. Are we, have you had this conversation with the boys or with Nora? Have we talked about this? Or, monitor stuff. But you have to be proactive. And there's a lot of softwares. There's softwares you can get on their phones that tells you their location, Live 360. I think you guys use that too.
Yeah.
Some of those same softwares will allow you to monitor what they look at. And there's just different things. And I am thankful technology is getting better at this. So I know Apple just introduced a thing that if a text message sends a picture that might have nudity on it, it will just block it. I've turned that on because now with all the technologies, it can read algorithms and different things, which is crazy.
Yeah.
Artificial intelligence, that kind of stuff. But when it gave me that option, do you want that option? I'm like, yeah, absolutely, I want that option because I don't want even someone just sending a text message that I can't monitor and then my kid gets exposed to something.
Right. Yeah, that is, I think, one of the most difficult things for parents to have to navigate is helping their kids realize, hey, this isn't a popular thing. This isn't a thing that I know that you're going to like, but we love you. And this is a constant conversation we have with our kids. We love you. This is why we do this. We love you. This is why we do this. And we want to protect you because while kids do need to learn to make decisions, you need to set them up for success.
Right.
Their young minds are developing and they're just figuring things out. And if you throw them, it'd be like throwing a baby to a wolf pack. And it's just, they don't have the means to protect themselves or to think through the consequences of their decisions to the fullest extent. So,
and even with some of their stuff, it might not even start with a full-on, there might not even be true lust in their heart when they're looking at stuff. It might simply be motivated by curiosity.
Right. They hear their friends talking about it.
Right. So, but then curiosity can lead to lust, can lead to addiction. And that's the part of it you want to protect your kids from. Can't shield them from all things, but that's why you have an open door where you can start having conversations so that they can come and talk to you. And if you build that trust with them, that you don't get mad and there's not punishment because you got exposed to something, then they'll be more apt to come and talk to you, and you can keep that door open.
Yeah. All right. So our last couple of questions really revolve around the idea of I would say where probably a predominant amount of people find themselves is they have been sexually active prior to marriage, or they have some form of sexual sin in their life that is either past or present, and they're trying to navigate and deal with the shame, the guilt, the realities of that. So how would you say someone who has found themselves currently sexually active or have been guilty of being sexually active prior to marriage or outside the bounds of marriage, how do they move forward?
Are they still in a relationship or not? Does it matter in this question?
I would say in this situation, let's just treat it as they've been sexually active in the past and they have guilt about it. Let's start there, and then we can go into.
Well, I think you need to understand where guilt comes from and where it doesn't. Guilt's not coming from God in the sense that we know in Scripture there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. So condemnation and conviction initially might feel like the same thing because they both expose sin. But conviction exposes sin with a motivating factor to run toward grace. So when you have sin exposed, but it's pushing you toward Jesus, that's conviction. When you have sin exposed and it's pushing you away from Jesus into shame and into guilt, that's condemnation, and that comes from Satan, not from God. God would never expose a sin that he doesn't want to forgive. So I hope people hear that. Yeah. God would never expose a sin that he doesn't want to forgive. God would never expose a sin that he doesn't want to set you free from. And so if he's exposing something, so if you heard it through a sermon, so if you were here on Sunday and heard that sermon and go, oh my goodness, I'm sitting in this area, know this, God who led that sermon and who wrote these truths in our Bible, he's doing that because he wants to lead you toward life. So the first thing I'd say is if you have been guilty of violating this and committing this sin, confess it. Repent, which means change your mind. Confess, acknowledge, agree with God on what it is. And if you confess your sin, he's faithful and just to forgive you. But there needs to be that part of changing your mind where you go, you know what? I used to operate a certain way because that's how I thought. Now I'm changing my mind and I'm going to live differently. And then I would say set up all the things we've talked about before, is set in your mind the standard that you're going to live by. I would encourage someone, if you have been I would even say, especially recently sexually active, or that's been a rhythm of your relationships, take some time not to date, because it will be very difficult to not go right back into that because you have ignited sexual desires in your life. Here's a reality. This might not be popular, but I'm still going to say it is, I think for the person who has been protecting their virginity and then they give up their virginity and they have sex, once that threshold has been crossed, it's easier to cross it again. And so once that you have got to that point, it's going to be easier. And then if you cross it, every time you're sexually active, it gets easier to be sexually active again. And that's just, studies show that, experience in people's lives show that. And so you need to reset. And one of the pastors that I like that writes about these things, Andy Stanley, wrote a book called The New Rules of Love, Sex, and Dating, I think it's called. But Andy Stanley, one of the things I've heard him say throughout the years is he encourages people, when you get into, like, if you have this new revelation about the sexual ethics of the Bible, he says, make a commitment not to date for a year. Like, and time is on our side. That seems like, oh, but I might miss out on my future husband, all that. Trust God. God's bigger than that. Right. And just make a commitment, because in that year you can reset. So if you have been sexually active and you're talking about the guilt and shame side of it, understand God gives you grace. He forgives you. If there's been sexual, like if you have been sexually used in your life and you feel that, go to God for healing, but also let's get counseling for you. Yeah. And because there are professionals that can help you, because that could have been tied toward abuse. It could have been tied toward different neglect you've had in your life. Maybe your father wasn't active, or you're talking to either one, male or female. Mother wasn't active and you're seeking out attention. Maybe there's some other root cause that's causing you to act out this way. Let's try to find that so that God can bring healing in that area. But then also in your life, you got to change some things, because that has been your pattern. It's like any pattern you want to change, any habit you want to change, there has to be a change of pattern in your behavior. And so I would encourage someone to do that.
So what would you say to someone who says, okay, I've repented, I'm working away from living in a sexually active lifestyle, and I'm in, they've waited a year, but they're in a relationship, and that those memories come back, that guilt, that shame comes back. How do you walk through that?
I think it's almost like you just repeat the process. It's like, okay, God, I know I'm forgiven. And maybe you don't know you're forgiven, but you need to remind yourself you're forgiven, but then go back to God and just say, God, I need your help again. And I think having honest conversations, if you're with a person that is worthy of you being with them, then you can have a conversation and you can help them understand what you're feeling. You can help them understand what you're experiencing. And then again, you're not designed to do life alone, so get help from a pastor, a director, a connect group leader, a godly friend, and get someone that has the same values as you, and have a conversation with them. Because the truth of it is, our sins do have consequences to them. That's one of the things I addressed on Sunday is what Paul said was a revolutionary idea. And obviously I believe he was inspired by the Spirit of God. But Paul says every other sin you commit outside your body, but he who sins sexually sins against his own body. Sex sins are different. Sex sins impact you differently than other sins. And so I wish I could give you this real simple answer that now that you know, nothing will ever come back. But that's not the reality. The reality is that is still the consequence of sin, and that you're going to have to work through it. But that said, the God who has convicted you is more powerful than even those feelings and those experiences. But it might be a process that just constantly you have to be reminded to just surrender those things to God and allow God to bring healing in your life.
Well, Matthew, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
That kind of gets us to the end of our questions. So
can I answer one more question though that I don't think I did?
Sure.
And if I did answer it, say, Matt, you've already said this. One of the things about protecting your kids, I was talking more from a perspective of protecting them from pornography. But when you talk about dating, be involved in your kids' dating lives. Okay. Don't allow, because kids sometimes can be dismissive, like, oh, I don't want to talk like I heard a parent recently say this: my kid will not talk to me at all about who they're dating, and actually went on to say, I'm not even positive they are. I know they're dating, but they've never acknowledged it in front of me, and they were like telling me this, and I was like, oh, never let that happen. That should not be a reality in your home. You should know who your kid's dating. You should know the person. You should know where they're going, who's going to be there. You should set parameters around your children and their dating life. And I'm saying all the way, if they're in your home, that's how it should be. And you should include that person that they're dating into your family life. Like, they need to at times spend time around you. Mm-hmm. So like my son who's dating, Cole who's dating, his girlfriend comes over our house frequently, and we want to know her. And I knew her from years ago because I coached her and stuff. She's wonderful, wonderful. We love her. But like, we want her to be around, and we want Cole to be at her house too, like with her parents and stuff. We want them to know Cole and stuff. But like, just again, have conversations, put parameters. Don't allow your kids to be in the home alone. Don't allow them to go to their bedrooms alone. Like, Cole's girlfriend will never once ever be in his bedroom, and Cole will never be in her bedroom. They can be in different parts of the house, but there needs to be able to be seen. And if they go into our basement, siblings will be around, potentially the doors open. You know what I mean? Like, put parameters. The whole idea, if someone would say like, oh, that doesn't show that you trust your kid. Man, I don't trust my kids in the sense of like, I didn't trust myself when I was that age. Right. It's not about them being good or bad. It's that I just want to protect them because I don't want them to experience something that stays with them in a negative way for the rest of their life.
Yeah. And that's what I tell my kids. Like, we don't have guidelines, and I don't, even in my own personal life, and I always tell them out of that, I don't put guidelines in my own life for the times that I'm on point. Right. I put, right. You know what I mean? Like, for sure, yeah. When I'm thinking straight, things are good. I don't need those guidelines, but I put those guidelines in place because you never know when you're not thinking straight. And so,
for sure. And it's like what we do even in our staff. Like, don't be alone with the opposite sex in a room. Don't go in a car ride with them. You triangulate stuff. If you have to communicate, so like if I'm texting you, or if I'm texting Cassie, I'm texting you and Cassie. If you're texting Mary, you're texting me and Mary, or someone else on staff.
Right.
I know there's never going to be an issue there. But I'm also just have parameters to protect that will never, ever be an issue in any of the relationships. So, yeah, I agree with what you said.
Well, thank you again, Matthew. And thank you all for listening today. I pray that this has been helpful to you. I hope it's answered the questions you guys have sent in. If you have questions, our next topic coming up is going to be revolving around racism. And if you want to go ahead and just even prepare some of those questions, Pastor Matthew will teach about it on Sunday. And then just submit your questions to I Could Be Wrong at the Tree.Church. And we'll do our best to answer them here in this podcast. So thank you all again for listening. Like and share and review wherever you listen. And we will be with you again next week.